Hi guys, my name is Mason. I'm a graduate student from Illinois State University studying video games, and I'm here to make playing video games feel like homework. Exciting. For those who don't know me, I actually graduated with a degree in English Studies and was looking to follow my dream job of being a technical writer in a game studio. I know, I don't shoot high. But I didn't spend that time idly. I happened to also read lots of this. Norton's Anthology of Classic English Literature. Now, I'll be honest, I dreaded reading this book, to the point where I started having an existential crisis. Why would anyone subject themselves to reading these ancient stories from centuries ago for meaning? And rather unfortunately, I actually ended up finding the answer to that exact question, something that would take me well past my English degree to figure out. You see, pretty much every exchange of stories, be it a book on a screen or Matt from IT explaining why he needs you to rerun those reports again, comes three important components: text, context, and subtext. Text is the literal words being said. Pretty straightforward. Context is a bit more abstract, but can be boiled down to being the situation that those words are being told in. And subtext is easily the most difficult. There are admittedly 1,000,001 videos telling you what is subtext, so I don't want to focus on that here. I'll largely be referring to it as the ideas and messages you get from reading between the lines. All of those tireless English assignments where you had to answer, what does this really mean, from high school, or if you're like me, from college, really boiled down to answering, after reading the text, what's the lesson the context and subtext are trying to show you? And while each of the components of writing are crucial to telling good stories, subtext is often the hardest component to master, since it's the only one the author doesn't have the same level of direct control over, and it's more difficult to understand. The first couple seasons of Game of Thrones uses subtext remarkably well to show the viewer the world and politics of Westeros, with rarely ever telling it to the viewer outright, which makes the story feel much more nuanced, and as people tend to call it, realistic. But, like my examples with Matt from earlier, stories aren't limited to fiction either, but can be day-to-day conversations too. Understanding subtext then gives you a leg up in reading these conversations. So really, all those dank and depressing English lessons filled with dry material in Shakespeare may seem like nonsense, but are actually trying to teach you how to read between the lines of situations you find yourself in and be able to figure out what the text, or well in this case conversation, really means. Now, the effectiveness of this is up to you. I know I sometimes question the way that I was taught this in high school, but that's besides the point. Now, you may be thinking, wait, Mason, if subtext can be things other than books, like TV shows, or your conversations with Matt, the lousiest IT worker in the office, does that mean that video games can have subtext too? And wow, what a great depiction of my coworker Matt. And also, yes, video games. You're right, it stands to reason that this works with games as well. After all, they tell stories just like TV shows and books in real-life situations. There are lots of games, in fact, that are quite famous for the narratives that they detail, from indie games to AAA. Naughty Dog's The Last of Us franchise especially paints quite a vivid picture of storytelling in games, with scenes that are tear-jerking, inspiring, and occasionally terrifying on an emotional level that few movies and shows can match. And through that, you can see that games, too, have subtext and meaning. Video over. But there are probably quite a few people who would call that into question. I mean, in the example of Last of Us, the narrative devices that I pointed out are largely attached to the game's larger narrative sequence, and the actual story of Last of Us isn't contained within the game itself. Rather, you play through the game levels that give you more context to the story, which is largely told through cinematics. In that sense, the game of Last of Us is very separate from the story of Last of Us, which holds into account the game's subtext and meaning. For games like Last of Us, then, where the story and the actual gameplay are only connected by settings and characters, can the games hold their own meaning? Well, yes, but perhaps not in the way that most people would think. If we are going to separate the story from the gameplay in terms of interpreting the game's meaning, we first need to take a look at what we're taking away from the story. There are a lot of games that work very hard to integrate the story and the gameplay into a single package, to interweave the two into a single narrative, while ultimately that is one potential way that we can show games have meaning. I'd like to focus on how any game's gameplay itself contains the core components of a story: text, context, and subtext, and through the creation of those, also create meaning. To understand how gameplay has meaning the same way as story does, we first need to know exactly what the text of gameplay is. And the question then is, what is the connecting tissue between all gameplay from any game? Interaction. If a game is going to be a game, there needs to be some sort of player involvement, being controlling a character in a first-person shooter, making decisions in a visual novel, or just looking around in a walking simulator. Any video game will always have some sort of interaction. Then, the interactions that the player has with the game, for instance, going over and shooting aliens in Halo, or buying a new chair in Animal Crossing, that serves as the text, the literal thing that's happening for this game. In that case, the context is the setting of the interaction, but from a mechanical perspective, instead of a narrative one. Perhaps this takes the form of a 3-wave arena, where enemies appear and come at you in 3 waves before you can move on to the next section. Or we can look at a more specific part of a game that says the context is a number of enemies appear and attack the player. Finally, the subtext then is what knowledge we can derive from the text and the context that isn't directly told to the player, but instead by reading between the lines of gameplay. In a simple scenario that we have set up here, the subtext also is probably pretty simple. The enemies are evil and need to be stopped, most likely killed in this case. After all, the enemies attacked you, and no matter how hard you may try, you can't get past the current placement in the level without defeating them first. In this case, the game frames violence as the only solution, and the enemies as the only target. Now, the example there is obviously pretty simple, and isn't a great reflection of trying to find the meaning in more complex games that we see today. So, let's take a look at a game that's known for its tremendous and amazing storytelling through gameplay. No, I'm not joking. Let's briefly touch on Call of Duty. Call of Duty is easily known as the most dude bro franchise of games that exist today, but it's also easy to forget that the franchise comes from very different roots. Call of Duty 2 feels very different from many Call of Duty games today, and it isn't just the graphics and settings that say that. For some brief context, the year is 2005. Major market games like Halo, Quake 4, and Star Wars Republic Commando dominate the FPS market. Gamers used to seeing themselves as one-person armies, super soldiers, and completely unstoppable. In many ways, the mechanics are very similar to each of the previous games, with the player taking on many enemies in a dramatic, fast-paced gunfight throughout a variety of set pieces. However, the gameplay with Call of Duty 2 is notable in how it simulates warfare, further driven by the narrative setting of the game in World War II. Each gunfight in Call of Duty is intense, dangerous, and especially on the higher difficulty levels, where running and gunning guarantees pretty much immediate death. Every time you encounter an enemy, you need to be quick to react and either accurate or lucky with your shots, or you'll end up instantly dead. And for every encounter you walk away from, you regularly see your comrades or compatriots who weren't nearly as lucky as you. One of the biggest climaxes of the game, the Battle for Hill 400, has the player take the role of an American soldier holding out for reinforcements against a German counterattack. This gameplay section, famous in gaming history for its back-to-the-wall gameplay moments, has the player feel the desperation of the situation. The American soldiers fighting alongside you die as the rest of the battalion gets battered by an unstoppable wall of German soldiers and artillery. There is a very legitimate desperation felt in the last moments, matched only by the extreme relief of seeing reinforcements arrive as you and the rest of your comrades are saved. All that is to say that the gameplay of Call of Duty holds up the game on its feet as a World War II simulation, rather than the minimal story there is, which is really only told through letters and the loading screens prior to the gameplay itself. When people are talking about what Call of Duty says about war and about World War II, people aren't discussing the text, context, and subtext of the narrative being crafted in a story format, but rather how the mechanics portray and represent World War II in gameplay. It's through the mechanics and interaction, which are in the player's direct control, that Call of Duty 2 serves as a prime example on how simulation and emulation in a game's mechanics in context of the world it crafts can be a driving factor for the interpretation of the game. No matter how you interpret what exactly Call of Duty 2 is saying, be it a glorification of war or an ode to the deadliest historical conflict of humankind, it clearly does speak through its mechanics and gameplay, and both the game's gripes and gems will be found from that. But Call of Duty's meanings regardless of what you take on it, are strung by a common thread, the representation and simulation of World War II. So, let's take a look at another game and talk about meaning in the gameplay from an entirely different perspective. Yes, of course, the king of video game narrative, Minecraft. There is no game that has a stronger storyline than this one. All jokes aside though, even if Minecraft really has no narrative in its gameplay, the core of the game lies entirely on its extremely well-polished mechanics. You still see people getting oddly existential online about it all the time. For instance,
the countryside of a peaceful land and steals all of its natural resources to satisfy his unquenchable thirst for pointless construction. Wait, am I the bad guy?
Minecraft's goalless gameplay lets us really take a look at the interpretation of mechanics themselves, with the text, the player's interactions with the world, and the context being the world itself. However, it's the subtext of Minecraft that really shows the nuance of the meaning in the world's mechanics. The game is ridden with monsters, skeletons, zombies, creepers, and more, all of which are threats to the player. The natural reaction of any player is to use what they have to build a shelter and survive, dealing with the inconvenience of having to gather food and obtaining armor to make sure they're safe. But of course, the game doesn't stop there. By now, the player's gotten used to creating items in Minecraft, so they set their sights on different projects, be it creative, practical, or something else entirely. The player starts to create items they enjoy, changing the world around them. By the time many players are wrapping up their playthroughs with a particular world, they brandish powerful diamond armor and weapons, and the enemies that sent them running at the beginning of the game now fall prey to automated traps or giant walls surrounding an estate hosting all of the imaginable living needs of the player. Now, the honest trailer guy paints this as a bleak image, but ultimately the game never enforces that you destroy the environment either, but rather gives that up to the power of the player. In this way, Minecraft's basic mechanics tell a story of how survival and resources gives them power over the world around them, which is a potential reading of the subtext of the situation. Like Call of Duty, Minecraft's story is told by the player and the interactions the player has with the game world. When we look at those interactions and how we can interpret them, we start to see them form their own subtext and meaning, like a more traditional narrative, only through game mechanics. While both of those examples have been pretty dramatically simplified for the sake of time, even armed with that basic knowledge, you have a lot of power. You can break down the basis of how actions the players take in either game naturally link to the game's mechanics. You can approach from a humanitarian perspective and talk about how mechanics in a game reflect on morality outside of the game. You can play the role of a game designer and really scope in and start talking more specifically about how individual mechanics affect gameplay. Really, the possibilities are endless. Understanding how the subtext and meaning behind game mechanics works gives you a more critical eye of all the games you play and enjoy. Ultimately, though, being able to understand the subtext and the meaning that the mechanics of a game add to the narrative lets you see how a game's mechanics can be integrated into the story and the experience of the player, and how that can be used to either support or bring about the downfall of a game's storyline and its gameplay. Thanks a ton for joining me on this one, guys. Obviously, this is just a very short overview of the topic that has a lot of nuance and could be talked about for tons of hours. You may have just seen the upper left-hand corner, different videos related to the subject matter of what I was talking about at a particular time. Each of these videos goes much more in depth and talk about some of the nuances and items that I was hitting on here in a lot more depth and detail. And they're certainly worth a watch if you're interested in learning more about video games as a whole or looking at them from a critical